spot.
Fine,
Yeah, sorry, guys. I mustn't move about.
Yeah.
Anyway, back in 1963, a scientist called Bob Rosenthal did an experiment. As always with these kinds of experiments, it involved mice. And he had 100 mice, and he put 50 of them in a box that said intelligent mice, and 50 in the box that said unintelligent mice. And he had a maze, in the middle of which was some cheese. And he recruited volunteers, and what the volunteers had to do was to pick out a mouse from one of the boxes, put it in the beginning of the maze, and then time how long it took to get to the cheese. And they did this, and they found that the ones from the box marked intelligent mice were slightly faster than the ones from the box marked unintelligent mice. Now you might think, well, that's what you were expecting. But it wasn't quite like that. The mice were in fact chosen at random, so that the one box weren't more intelligent than the other, they were just, that's the way it turned out. And they repeated the experiment, and the same thing happened. So what appeared to be happening is because the volunteers were expecting the intelligent mice to do better, they did better. The expectations caused the mice to fulfill the expectations, either being bright or dim. Now that's a rather spectacular bit of research. That echoes lots of other bits of research where it's not mice but humans. So, for example, as I'm sure all you retired school teachers know, if you expect your pupils to do really badly, they do badly. If you expect your pupils to do better, they do better. Likewise, if the police expect all the youngsters in the neighbourhood to be criminal, the crime rate is high. If they expect them to be good, the crime rate might come down. It's not as simple as that, but that's roughly what goes on. Same thing happens with medicines. If you get this bottle of medicine, and it says one of the side effects is you might have a headache, you're far more likely to have the headache than if that wasn't there in the first place. We all know that. So expectations matter. Now, one of the striking things about Christianity is how very high the expectations are. Just think of the Sermon on the Mount, and we heard one bit of it. Just within that bit, some of the expectations that Jesus has of us. We rely totally on God for food and clothing. We never say an angry word. We love our persecutors and our enemies, and we pray for them. Oh gosh, it goes on. Mustn't have any lustful thoughts either, and no anger as well. They're very high expectations they put on us. And so Jesus is expecting the best of us. But there's a problem. And the problem is exemplified by an old friend of mine called Bernard Mobbs, who died 2 or 3 years ago. Now, Bernard was an officer in the Salvation Army. And there's no organisation which has higher standards than the Sally Army. They really do load on the expectations, and the Sally Army officers live as close as possible to the Sermon on the Mount. Bernard, as I say, was an officer. His mum and dad were both officers, so he'd grown up in the Salvation Army. And then he married an officer, so he was completely surrounded, imbued by the Sally Army culture. And he wrote wonderful Bible study notes for the Salvation Army to use. He was a really bright chap. But he was never contented. He never felt he was living up to the expectations. He always felt he was falling short. And it tormented him, this sense of falling short. And eventually he left the Salvation Army and joined the Church of England, and eventually became a vicar, thinking that the Church of England's soft edges might be slightly better, easier to live with. But he still didn't feel contentment, peace. And I once had a conversation with him about God's forgiving love, and he knew the theory of God's forgiveness, but he didn't feel it. He felt he had to earn God's forgiveness, which negates the whole thing, of course. It must be a free gift. He just couldn't get through from the intellect, knowing about God's forgiveness, to the actual experience in the heart. He died 2 or 3 years ago. Sadly, I've lost touch with him, so I'm not sure what state he was in latterly, but that's as it was when I knew him. In other words, the expectations that Christ was loading on him were too great. He just couldn't handle it. But here's a strange thing. Jesus seems to want us to fall short, to stumble. After all, as we heard just now, Jesus predicted that Peter would betray him. Jesus knew that most of the disciples would run away. That's what, as it were, Jesus expected. So although he was seemingly putting on huge expectations onto people's shoulders, in fact he knows we're all going to fall short. to that extent, Bernard was right. Bernard was falling short, as we all do. We don't live fully as the Sermon on the Mount tells us. We're not up to it. We're not quite there. So how does that all work out? How can it be that Jesus is expecting us to do something that he knows we'll fail in? How does that work? Now, all of you are people of good taste and sophistication and culture and so on. So you'll be familiar with the musical My Fair Lady. Do you know? Yeah, rings a bell? I love it so much, I could at one stage sing all the songs. I think I'm a bit rusty now, and I'm not going to attempt anyway. And it's a wonderful story, just to remind you. There's Henry Higgins, played by Rex Harrison, and he's a professor of dialect and accent, and he reckons he can locate where somebody was born to the nearest street. And he has a bet with his friend Colonel Pickering that he can take a flower girl off the street in Covent Garden and teach her to speak like a princess. And Eliza Doolittle, all I want is room somewhere, is the person that he recruits for this experiment. And at first, Eliza Doolittle can't cope with the expectations. Henry Higgins is expecting her to speak beautifully, and she just can't. And then suddenly, she gets the idea. And he says, what does he say? By George, she's got it. Yes, you knew all that. I was just testing you to see if you were awake. And so eventually, so she can say, the rain in Spain stays mainly on the plain. All that. We know it all. So she lives up to the expectations eventually. But then, to his real annoyance, she not only speaks like a princess, but she begins to behave like one and think of herself as a princess. And he becomes very annoyed. But then he accidentally falls in love with her, and it's all fine in the end. Anyway, now, as you probably know, that musical is based on the play by George Bernard Shaw called Pygmalion. And the actual Pygmalion refers back to a Greek myth. And the Greek myth is rather extraordinary. Pygmalion was a sculptor. The finest sculptor of his time, lived in Cyprus. And one day he sculpted in wood the most beautiful woman you could possibly imagine. Perfect specimen, full life size. But then she was so beautiful and so wonderful and so lovely, he fell in love with her. And so intense was his love for this sculpted woman that she came to life. And she actually became his wife. Now that's the Greek myth, as it were, that the love can bring to life. Now that, I think, is a rather wonderful image of what I'm trying to express. Yes, we are going to fall short, but actually the power, the intensity, the warmth of God's love for us is such that it burns away all the sense of guilt, of falling short, all the sense that we're not up to it, all the sense that God is judging us and finding us wanting. That's burnt away by the warmth of God's love for us. And we come to life. We come truly to life in the power and the love of God. His warmth is in our hearts. We are born again in his love. And that image of Pygmalion and his love bringing a woman to life is actually rather a good image of what happens to us when we come to Christ. His love brings us to new life by burning away the sense of guilt and of falling short. Now, going back to My Fair Lady, when it was first on the stage in the 1950s, Eliza Doolittle was played by Julie Andrews, yes, of course, Julie Andrews. And she did it wonderfully, and she has a perfect voice, and she sang the songs perfectly. But then when they came to make the film, they decided that Julie Andrews wasn't starry enough and not quite beautiful enough. So they recruited the person that was deemed then to be the most beautiful woman in the world, namely Audrey Hepburn. Yes. I'm not sure she was that beautiful, actually, but that's a matter of taste. Anyway, they recruited her, but the thing about Audrey Hepburn is she couldn't sing. She may have been starry, but couldn't sing a note. In fact, I heard on Radio 2 the other day her actually singing Moon River. Dreadful. So no wonder they didn't have her singing the songs. And they recruited a professional singer. Anyone happen to know her name? Marley Nixon, that's right. You're almost up to this. Marley Nixon, who was a professional singer, and she sang the songs, and Audrey Hepburn mouthed the words. And it works perfectly well, but not quite as well as Julie Andrews. Julie Andrews, of course, had her revenge when she made such a success of The Sound of Music. What I'm getting to, rather laboriously, is the point about Audrey Hepburn is she had to rely on another person, Marnie Nixon, to sing the songs. And that's what we have to learn to do. What Bernard couldn't manage was to rely on God. He felt he had to find the strength in himself to cope, to be the true Christian. He couldn't bring himself to depend wholly on God. And that's the challenge for each and every one of us, to learn to rely on God in the way that in the Sermon on the Mount he asks us to rely on him for food and shelter, to rely on him for everything. That's the invitation that we're made, and that's how we become Christians, relying on God for all things. And if we do rely on God, then he becomes our voice, he becomes everything that we need. Let's now sing